When she showed up for a job interview, the woman saw a photo of her mother in a black frame in the Millionaire's office. What she said left him speechless. Lila's alarm buzzed incessantly, pulling her from a restless sleep. She blinked groggily at the small clock on her nightstand, then let out a sigh. Another early morning, another long day ahead. As she shuffled out of bed, she caught a glimpse of her grandmother's room. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, she could see the gentle rise and fall of her grandmother's frail chest. The rhythmic breathing brought Lila a small sense of comfort. No matter how hard things got, she always found solace in knowing her grandmother was still there, still fighting. After quickly dressing in a simple blouse and slacks, she tiptoed into the kitchen. The coffee machine sputtered as it brewed, filling the tiny apartment with a faint aroma that helped ease her nerves. Today was an important day. She had been invited for an interview at Whitman Enterprises, one of the most prestigious companies in the city. She had applied on a whim, never really expecting to get a response. But when she received the call, her heart had nearly stopped. As she sipped her coffee, she couldn't help but think about how much this opportunity could change everything. Money had always been tight, especially with her grandmother's mounting medical bills. The old woman had been the only family Lila had left since her mother's death when she was just a child. The thought of finally being able to provide better care for her grandmother made Lila's heart swell with hope. She glanced at the small photograph on the refrigerator. It was an old, slightly faded picture of her mother smiling brightly as she held a much younger Lila in her arms. "I hope you're watching over me today, Mom," she whispered. "I could really use a bit of your luck." The ride to Whitman Enterprises was nerve-wracking. Lila had never been to that part of town before, where the buildings seemed to touch the sky and the streets were lined with luxury cars. She could feel herself shrinking as she walked through the glass doors of the towering building, clutching her resume tightly in her hands. The lobby was vast, with marble floors that seemed to stretch on forever and large windows that let in the morning light. Everything about the place screamed success, and Lila felt distinctly out of place. She was directed to the elevator and handed a visitor's badge. Her heart raced as she rode up to the 20th floor. The entire way up, she rehearsed her answers to potential interview questions, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. What if they could tell she didn't belong here? What if they saw right through her? The elevator door slid open with a quiet chime, and Lila stepped into a tastefully decorated office space. She was greeted by a receptionist who, with a warm smile, asked her to wait for a few minutes. Lila took a seat, her hands fidgeting in her lap as she waited. She glanced around the room, trying to take in her surroundings. The office was elegant and understated, a testament to wealth and power. Her eyes wandered to the large mahogany desk at the far end of the room. That's when she saw it. A photograph in a sleek black frame resting on the desk. Lila's breath hitched. The woman in the picture. It couldn't be. She felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized the familiar face. It was her mother. There was no mistaking it. Even after all these years, Lila would recognize that smile anywhere. She felt her legs go weak, and for a moment she considered running out of the building, but her feet were glued to the floor. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the photograph. Why would John Whitman, a man she had never met, have a picture of her mother on his desk? Before she could make sense of it, a door behind the desk opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority that seemed to fill the room. Lila recognized him immediately from the news articles she had seen. John Whitman, CEO of Whitman Enterprises. "Lila, right?" he said, extending a hand as he approached her. "Thank you for coming in today." Lila quickly stood, her mind still reeling from the sight of the photograph. She shook his hand, hoping he wouldn't notice how clammy her palms had become. "Yes, thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Whitman." "Please call me John," he said, giving her a polite smile. "Let's get started, shall we?" As he gestured for her to sit, Lila's eyes flickered back to the photograph on his desk. She had so many questions swirling in her head, but this was an interview. She had to focus, no matter how much her heart was pounding. For now, she had to push the picture out of her mind and get through the next hour. John began with the usual questions. asking about her background, her experience, her skills. Lila answered as best as she could, trying to keep her voice steady, but she could tell he wasn't entirely focused on her answers. He seemed distracted, as if he was thinking about something else. Then, without warning, he shifted the conversation. "Lila, I hope you don't mind me asking, but where did you grow up?" The question caught her off guard. Mostly with my grandmother," she said. "My mother passed away when I was a child." John's eyes softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. And your father?" "I never knew him," Lila replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother never talked about him." John was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said finally, his voice low. "There's something I need to tell you, but I'm not sure how to say it." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she didn't dare interrupt. John took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "That photograph on my desk, the woman in it was someone I loved deeply a long time ago." Lila felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. Her mother, loved by this man. It didn't make any sense. "That's my mother," she said, her voice barely audible. "She died 20 years ago." John's eyes widened, and he leaned back in his chair, clearly stunned. For a moment, the room was completely silent, and then he whispered, "I think we need to have a different kind of conversation, Lila." John's words hung heavy in the air, and Lila felt like she was drowning in a sea of confusion. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she tried to make sense of what he had just said. There was no mistaking the sincerity in his voice, but it made everything all the more bewildering. How could this man have known her mother? Why would he have a picture of her on his desk? She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but the words seemed trapped in her throat. John sat back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. It was as if he was seeing a ghost. "I know this must be shocking for you," he said gently. "Believe me, it's just as shocking for me. But I need to explain, and I owe you the truth." Lila felt a rush of emotions, fear, curiosity, and a flicker of hope. She nodded, trying to keep herself composed, but she could already feel her hands trembling. "Please tell me," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. John took a deep breath, his eyes softening as he began. "Your mother, her name was Evelyn, wasn't it?" Lila nodded, and he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Evelyn and I met over 20 years ago. She was one of the kindest, most beautiful souls I'd ever known. We were very much in love." Lila's breath hitched, and her mind raced. She had always known her mother as a gentle, loving woman who had worked hard to provide for her. But she had never spoken about any relationships, certainly not about someone as significant as this. "I don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "If you knew my mother, why? Why didn't she ever mention you?" John's expression tightened, and he seemed to struggle with the words. "Because we were forced apart," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "It was not by choice. Circumstances? Certain people made sure that we couldn't be together." Lila's heart ached as she saw the pain in his eyes. This wasn't just about business or an old flame. There was something much deeper at play. "But how?" she pressed, leaning forward. "What happened?" John hesitated, as if unsure how much to reveal. "We had planned to build a life together," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "But then everything fell apart. I received a letter one day, supposedly from her, saying she was leaving, that she didn't love me anymore, and I should never try to find her." Lila's eyes widened. "That doesn't sound like my mother at all. She would never have done something like that." "I know," John said, nodding. "I never believed it, but I was young, and I was devastated. I thought maybe I had done something to push her away. It wasn't until much later that I found out the letter was fake." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. Fake? But who would do something like that? John's jaw clenched, and for a moment a flicker of anger crossed his features. "I thought it was one of my rivals," he said. Someone who didn't want me to be distracted by love when there was business to be done. But now, I'm not so sure. Lila's mind was reeling. It was as if the pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know existed were slowly coming together, but the picture was still unclear. You said you thought it was a rival, she said carefully. But now you're not sure? John nodded. Yes. Over the years I tried to move on, but I could never quite let go of her. When I heard she had passed away, it felt like my heart broke all over again. I thought I would never have the chance to find out what really happened. Until today. Until I met you. Lila's eyes met his, and she saw something there she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. This man who seemed so powerful and in control was bearing a part of himself that had clearly been hidden away for years. Why do you have her picture on your desk? She asked, her voice softer now. Why now, after all this time? John's gaze dropped to the photograph, and he reached out, gently brushing his fingers over the frame. Because I've been trying to find closure, he said. I've had it there for years as a reminder of what I lost. But seeing you today, it feels like she's come back to me, like a part of her is still here. Lila didn't know what to say. She had come here for a job interview, and now she was sitting across from a man who had apparently been in love with her mother, a man who might be the missing piece of a past she never fully understood. You said circumstances kept you apart, she said, her voice barely steady. What circumstances? John hesitated, his eyes darkening slightly. There were forces at play, he said carefully. People who wanted to make sure Evelyn and I would never see each other again. I had my suspicions back then, but I could never prove anything. Now, I think I may have been right. Lila's heart was pounding. This was more than just a story of lost love. It was starting to sound like a conspiracy. What do you mean? She asked, leaning forward. Are you saying someone kept you apart on purpose? John nodded slowly. Yes. I believe someone manipulated us, forced her away from me and covered their tracks. I've spent years trying to figure out who it could have been, but every time I got close, something would happen to throw me off. And then I heard about the accident. Lila's breath hitched. The accident. The car crash that had taken her mother's life. You think the accident wasn't... John met her eyes, and there was a heaviness in his gaze. I don't think it was an accident, he said quietly. I think it was planned. Lila felt the world tilt. She had grown up believing her mother's death was a tragic but random event. The idea that it could have been orchestrated, that someone had deliberately caused it, was almost too much to bear. Why would anyone? She began, but her voice faltered. I don't know, John said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I intend to find out. And now that I know you're her daughter, that you're my daughter, I owe it to both of you to get to the truth. Lila's mind was spinning. Your daughter? The words felt strange on her tongue. You think I'm your daughter? I know it, John said softly, his eyes searching hers. It all makes sense now. The timing, the way you look. You have her eyes, Lila. I see so much of her in you. I never had any children, and now I understand why. Because she was carrying you when we were torn apart. Lila's head was swirling with emotions, confusion, fear, disbelief, but also a strange, inexplicable sense of belonging. This is all too much, she said, trying to catch her breath. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, John said gently. I know this is a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to process it all at once. But I want to help you, and I want to find out what really happened to your mother. I couldn't do it back then, but maybe we can do it together now. Lila felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. She didn't know whether to be angry or relieved, but she knew one thing for certain. She wanted answers. I want to know the truth, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. If someone did this to my mother, I want to know who, and I want to make sure they pay for it. John nodded, a determined look in his eyes. Then we'll do it together, no matter what it takes. Lila left Whitman Enterprises that day with her head spinning. The world outside seemed the same. The bustling city streets, the hum of traffic, the sun casting its warm glow over the buildings. But inside, everything had changed. She had walked into that office expecting nothing more than a job interview, but she had walked out with a possible father, a mystery to solve, and a flood of emotions she hadn't even begun to understand. She barely remembered the bus ride back to her apartment. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess, replaying every word John had said. Could it be true? The idea that this man she had never known, this successful CEO, was her father felt surreal. It was like a plot twist from a movie she'd seen 1,000 times, but never imagined she'd be living. When she finally reached her apartment, she was greeted by the familiar scent of home-cooked stew. Her grandmother, a small, frail woman with a gentle smile, was stirring a pot on the stove. "You're back, dear," she said, turning to look at Lila. "How was the interview?" Lila hesitated, unsure of how to even begin explaining what had happened. "It was different," she said, setting her bag down. "Grandma, can we talk?" Her grandmother's smile faded as she saw the seriousness in Lila's eyes. She turned off the stove and motioned for them to sit at the small kitchen table. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" Lila took a deep breath. "I met a man today. His name is John Whitman, and he knew Mom. He says he was in love with her, and they were separated before I was born." Her grandmother's eyes widened, and she seemed to freeze for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. "John Whitman," she repeated, almost as if she was testing the name on her tongue. "I remember hearing that name once, a long time ago. Your mother mentioned it, but she never said much." Lila felt a jolt of curiosity. "What did she say?" "She was sad," her grandmother said, her eyes distant as if recalling a memory long buried. "She said he was a good man, but that things didn't work out. She never wanted to talk about it again after that." Lila's heart clenched. "Grandma, John, he thinks he's my father." The room went silent. Her grandmother's face softened, and she reached out to take Lila's hand. "Oh, sweetie, I always wondered. Your mother never told me the whole story, but I had my suspicions. She was so secretive about that part of her life, and I never understood why. I wish I had pushed her more to tell me." Lila felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "He said he never knew she was pregnant, that they were separated because of a fake letter. He thinks someone wanted to keep them apart." Her grandmother's expression darkened. That poor girl. She always seemed like she was carrying a heavy burden. I tried to get her to open up, but she just smiled and said everything would be fine. I never imagined. I'm so sorry, Lila. I should have asked more questions. Lila squeezed her grandmother's hand, feeling a surge of determination. It's not your fault, Grandma, but I want to find out what really happened. John said he wants to help. He thinks someone was behind Mom's accident, that it wasn't just an accident. Her grandmother's eyes widened in shock. But that's impossible, isn't it? How could anyone? I don't know, Lila said, shaking her head. But if there's even a chance that it's true, I need to find out. I need to know why she never got to tell me who my father was. I can't keep living with these unanswered questions. Her grandmother nodded, though her eyes were filled with concern. Just be careful, dear. Digging into the past can be dangerous. Sometimes there are things people don't want to be found. Lila understood the warning, but she had already made up her mind. She couldn't ignore this, not now. I will, Grandma, she said softly. But I have to do this. The next morning, Lila found herself standing in front of Whitman Enterprises again, this time with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. She had barely slept, her mind too busy sorting through the revelations from the day before, but she was ready. She needed answers, and John was the key to getting them. When she stepped into John's office, he was already waiting for her. The look on his face was different today, more serious, almost as if he had been preparing himself for whatever was about to happen. Lila, he said, standing up and offering a small tentative smile. I'm glad you came back. I know this must be overwhelming. Lila nodded, taking a seat across from him. I have questions, and I need you to be honest with me. Completely honest." "Of course," John said, his expression sincere. "Ask me anything." Lila took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "You said someone sent you a fake letter pretending it was from my mom. Do you have any idea who could have done that?" John hesitated, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. "I have my suspicions," he said finally. "At the time, I thought it was a business rival, someone who wanted me to be focused solely on my work and not be distracted by love. But after seeing you and realizing everything I didn't know, I'm not sure anymore." Lila's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean there are too many coincidences," he said, leaning forward. "Your mother's sudden departure, the letter, and then the accident. It's all too convenient. I've spent years trying to put the pieces together, but every lead I followed seemed to hit a dead end. I thought I was being paranoid, but now I'm starting to think I wasn't looking in the right place." Lila felt a chill. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that whoever wanted to keep us apart didn't just want to ruin my life," John said, his voice growing firmer. "They wanted to erase any possibility of us reconnecting, and if they were willing to go that far, I fear they may have had a hand in what happened to your mother." Lila's hands clenched into fists. "Then we need to find out who it was. I can't just sit back and do nothing." John's eyes met hers, and she could see a determination there that matched her own. "I agree, but we have to be careful. Whoever did this was willing to go to great lengths to cover their tracks, and if they realize we're digging, they won't be happy about it." Lila swallowed hard, but she nodded. "I understand, but I'm not afraid. If someone did this to her, if they hurt my mother, I want them to pay." John smiled, though it was a sad, weary smile. "You're so much like her," he said softly. "She was always so brave, even when things were tough." Lila felt a lump form in her throat. She had heard stories of her mother's kindness and strength, but to hear it from someone who had loved her, it made everything feel more real, more painful. "What do we do next?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "We start by retracing her last days," John said, his tone turning businesslike. "I want to see if there's anything we missed back then, a clue, a detail that didn't make sense. I've kept all the old files and notes from my investigation, and I'll share them with you. Maybe there's something we overlooked." Lila nodded, grateful for his willingness to involve her. "Okay, let's do it." As they began to discuss their plan, she felt a strange sense of unity. It was still surreal to think of him as her father, but there was a part of her that wanted to believe it, that wanted to find a connection to the past she had lost. But as she left his office that day, one thought kept echoing in her mind. If someone had gone to such great lengths to keep them apart, there had to be a reason, and whatever it was, she was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The next few days passed in a blur as Lila and John began their investigation in earnest. John provided her with stacks of documents, old letters, and newspaper clippings. Each evening after work, Lila would sift through the materials, searching for anything that might hint at the truth. It was overwhelming, and at times she felt like she was drowning in a sea of dead ends and half-truths, but John's determination kept her going. One evening, as they sat in John's office surrounded by papers, Lila found herself glancing at the photograph of her mother again. It was a beautiful picture, taken in what looked like a garden, with her mother smiling warmly at the camera. The sight of it filled Lila with a mix of sadness and longing. "When was this photo taken?" she asked, her voice soft. John looked up from the file he was reading and followed her gaze. "That was taken the last time we were together," he said quietly. "We had spent the day at a park just outside the city. I remember thinking it was one of the happiest days of my life." He paused, his eyes distant. "I had no idea it would be one of the last." Lila felt a pang in her chest. "She looks so happy," she said, almost to herself. "She was," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "At least I thought she was. But then she disappeared and everything changed." Lila didn't know what to say. She had grown up with so many questions about her mother, and now she had even more. But she also felt a strange comfort in knowing that there was someone else who had loved her as much as she did. "We'll find out what happened," she said, more for herself than for him. "We have to." John nodded, his expression resolute. "I believe we will, but it won't be easy. There are people who went to great lengths to make sure the truth was buried, and they won't let it come to light without a fight." As the evening wore on, they continued to dig through the documents, but it felt like they were getting nowhere. Lila could sense the frustration building within her, and she was about to suggest calling it a night when she noticed something odd. One of the letters John had received, supposedly from her mother, was dated only a week before her death. The handwriting was neat, but there was something about it that didn't seem quite right. "John, look at this," she said, handing him the letter. "Do you see anything strange?" John took the letter and studied it, his brow furrowing. "It's her handwriting," he said, though he sounded uncertain, but Lila pointed to the signature. "It doesn't match. I remember how she used to sign her name on my school forms, and this, it looks similar, but it's not the same." John's eyes widened as he looked closer. "You're right," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I can't believe I didn't notice this before." Lila's heart raced. "Do you think someone forged it?" "It's possible," John said, his mind clearly racing with possibilities. "But if that's true, it means someone was trying to manipulate her actions even right up until her death. We need to find out who could have had access to her and why they would do this." Lila's stomach twisted with a mix of fear and anger. "Do you think this has something to do with the accident?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "I don't know," John said, but there was a grim look on his face. "But it's starting to feel like everything is connected. We need to follow this lead and see where it takes us." Over the next few days, Lila and John began to focus their investigation on the days leading up to her mother's death. They scoured through old records, looking for anyone who might have had a reason to forge the letter or interfere with her life. It was exhausting work, and the more they dug, the more questions they seemed to uncover. One night, after another long day of searching, John decided to take Lila to a place he hadn't been in years. "I want to show you something," he said as they left the office. "It might help you understand why this is so important to me." They drove to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, and soon they pulled up in front of a small, charming house. The garden was overgrown, and the paint on the shutters was peeling, but there was a sense of warmth to the place, even in its disrepair. "This was where we were going to live," John said as they stepped out of the car. "Your mother and I bought it together. We planned to fix it up, make it our home." Lila's heart ached as she looked at the house. She could almost picture her mother there, planting flowers in the garden or sitting on the porch enjoying a cup of tea. "I had no idea," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never got to move in," John continued, his eyes distant. "After she left, I couldn't bring myself to come back here. But I kept the house, even though it was painful, because it was all I had left of her. I thought maybe one day I'd find out why she left, and now I finally have a chance to understand." Lila felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you for showing me this," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It means a lot." John nodded, and for a moment they stood there in silence, both lost in their thoughts. "There's one more thing," he said finally, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, weathered key. "I want you to have this. It's the key to the house. If you ever need a place to think or just be closer to her, it's yours." Lila took the key, her hands shaking slightly. "I don't know what to say," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." "You don't have to say anything," John said gently. "I'm just glad you're here, and I promise we'll get to the bottom of this, whatever it takes." The next morning, John received a call that would change everything. One of his old contacts, a private investigator he had hired years ago, had found something. "John, I'm not sure what to make of this, but I think you should see it for yourself," the man said. "I dug up some old records, and there's a name that keeps coming up. Someone who had connections to Evelyn's life around the time of her death." John's pulse quickened. "Who?" "The name is Malcolm Warren. the investigator said. "He was a business associate of yours, wasn't he?" John's heart dropped. Malcolm Warren had been more than just a business associate. He had been a close friend, someone he had trusted implicitly. "Yes, he was," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What does he have to do with this?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," the investigator admitted. "But there are some strange financial transactions between him and a few other parties around the time of Evelyn's death. It looks like someone was being paid to keep quiet about something." John's mind raced. Could Malcolm have been involved in the conspiracy that tore him and Evelyn apart? It seemed unthinkable, but the pieces were starting to fit together. "Thank you," he said to the investigator. "Keep digging. I need to know everything." After he hung up, John turned to Lila, who had been listening intently. "We might have a lead," he said, his voice taut with tension. "But if Malcolm was involved, this is going to get a lot more complicated." Lila could see the pain in his eyes, but she felt a surge of determination. "Then we'll figure it out," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever it takes." John nodded, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "You remind me so much of her," he said quietly. "Your strength, your courage. She would be so proud of you." Lila felt her heart swell, but she pushed the emotion aside. There would be time for that later. For now, they had a new lead to follow, and she was ready to do whatever it took to find the truth, even if it meant confronting a man who had once been a trusted friend of her newly discovered father. The next few days were a whirlwind as Lila and John prepared to confront the possibility that Malcolm Warren, a man John once trusted, might be involved in the conspiracy that led to Evelyn's death. The idea was almost too painful for John to accept, but he knew they had to follow this lead, no matter how difficult it was. John arranged a meeting with Malcolm at a quiet, upscale cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was a place where they used to have business lunches, but this time the atmosphere felt different, charged with an unspoken tension. As they arrived, John glanced at Lila, who was sitting beside him in the car, her face set with a mixture of determination and anxiety. "You don't have to be here for this," he said gently, though he knew she wouldn't back down. "I can handle Malcolm on my own." Lila shook her head. "I want to be here," she said firmly. "I need to see this through." John nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "All right, let's go." They stepped out of the car and entered the cafe, where Malcolm was already waiting at a table by the window. He stood up when he saw them, a warm smile spreading across his face. "John, it's been too long," he said, extending his hand. "And this must be Lila. I've heard a lot about you." Lila shook his hand, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. "Nice to meet you," she said, her tone polite but guarded. John forced a smile, though his mind was racing. "Yes, it has been a while, Malcolm," he said, taking a seat. "I'm glad you could make time to see us." Of course," Malcolm said, still smiling as he sat down. "What's on your mind?" John took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I need to ask you about something that happened a long time ago," he began, his eyes fixed on Malcolm's. "Something involving Evelyn." For a brief moment, Malcolm's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Evelyn?" he said, feigning confusion. "I'm not sure I understand." "I think you do," John said, his voice low and steady. "I know about the letters, the ones that were sent to me supposedly from her, telling me to stay away. And I know that someone was paying people to keep quiet about what happened around the time of her death. I need to know if you had anything to do with it." Malcolm's eyes flickered, and Lila could see a brief flash of something, surprise maybe, or fear. But then he laughed, a sound that felt forced and hollow. "John, this was years ago," he said, shaking his head. "Why are you bringing this up now? Whatever happened back then, it's in the past." "Because it's not just the past," John said, his voice growing sharper. "It's about my daughter's mother, and it's about the fact that I was lied to, manipulated, and kept away from the woman I loved. So, I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you have anything to do with it?" The tension at the table was palpable, and for a moment it seemed as if Malcolm was going to deny everything. But then he sighed, and the smile faded from his face. "John, you don't want to go down this road," he said quietly. "Sometimes the truth isn't worth the trouble it brings." Lila felt a surge of anger. "What do you mean by that?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "If you know something, you need to tell us." Malcolm looked at her, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Lila," he said softly, "but there are things you don't understand, things that can't be undone." John's patience snapped. "Enough with the vague answers, Malcolm," he said, his voice rising. "I trusted you. If you had anything to do with what happened to Evelyn, I deserve to know." Malcolm sighed again, his shoulders slumping. "All right," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'll tell you, but you're not going to like it." Malcolm's confession came out slowly, as if every word was a struggle. He explained how years ago he had been approached by another business associate, someone with connections to John's rivals. This person had proposed a deal. If Malcolm helped drive a wedge between John and Evelyn, he would receive a lucrative business opportunity in return. At the time, Malcolm hadn't thought much of it. He had seen it as a way to secure his own future, not realizing the full extent of what he was getting involved in. "The letter wasn't my idea," Malcolm said, his voice hollow. "But I delivered it. I was the one who made sure it got to you, John. I didn't know it would lead to what happened." Lila felt like she had been punched in the gut. "You're saying you helped them separate my parents," she said, her voice barely steady. "And you never thought to tell anyone?" "I thought it was just business," Malcolm said, sounding almost defensive. "I didn't know it would end like this. I was young, stupid, and greedy. I made a mistake, and I've had to live with it ever since." John's hands clenched into fists. "Do you know who was behind it?" he asked, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "Who orchestrated the whole thing?" Malcolm hesitated, glancing nervously around the cafe. "I don't know his real name," he said finally. "I only knew him by his alias, Gray. He was connected, powerful, the kind of man you don't cross if you want to keep your life intact. I haven't heard from him in years." Lila exchanged a look with John. This was the first time they had heard of anyone referred to as Gray, but it was a lead. "We need to find out who he is," she said, her voice filled with determination. "If he was involved in separating you and my mother, then he might have been behind her death too." John nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. "Thank you for telling us, Malcolm," he said, though there was no warmth in his voice. "But this isn't over." Malcolm's face tightened, and he looked genuinely frightened. "I've told you everything I know," he said, his voice shaky. "But if you're planning to dig into this, be careful. Gray doesn't leave loose ends. If he finds out you're looking for him, he won't hesitate to silence you." That night, John and Lila sat together in his office, trying to make sense of everything they had learned. The revelation that Malcolm had been involved was painful, but it had also given them a new direction. Now they had a name, even if it was just an alias, Gray. "Do you think Malcolm was telling the truth?" Lila asked, her brow furrowed. "Or was he just trying to throw us off?" "I believe he was telling the truth," John said, though there was a weariness in his voice. He had nothing to gain by lying at this point, and the fear in his eyes, that was real. Whoever this Gray is, he must be dangerous. Lila felt a shiver run down her spine. "Then we need to be smart about this," she said. "We can't just start asking questions. We need to find out who Gray is without drawing too much attention to ourselves." John nodded. "Agreed. I'll reach out to some contacts discreetly. There are still people who owe me favors, and I'm sure one of them might have heard of this Gray. But you need to promise me something, Lila." "What is it?" she asked, looking up at him. "If things start to get dangerous, you have to walk away," he said, his eyes serious. "I don't want you getting hurt because of my past." Lila shook her head. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "This is my fight, too. Whoever did this took my mother away from me, and I'm not going to let them get away with it." John saw the determination in her eyes and knew there was no point in arguing. "All right," he said softly. "We'll do this together, but we have to be careful. Whoever Gray is, he's not going to let us find him without a fight." As they sat there making plans and strategizing, Lila felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, she was getting closer to the truth about her mother, and she had John by her side. But she also knew that they were stepping into dangerous territory, and there was no telling what they might uncover. Whatever happened next, she was ready. She had spent her whole life with unanswered questions, and now she was finally getting the chance to find the answers she had been searching for, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. Over the following week, John and Lila worked tirelessly, discreetly following leads and reaching out to John's old contacts. Every clue they uncovered seemed to lead them further down a dark and tangled path. But one thing was clear. Whoever this mysterious Gray was, he had been pulling strings from behind the scenes for a long time. John was careful about who he contacted, knowing that even a hint of what they were investigating could alert the wrong people. He reached out to former associates, retired business partners, and anyone who might have had dealings with powerful figures during the time he and Evelyn were separated. Despite his efforts, information on Gray was scarce, almost as if he was a ghost who left no trace. Lila, meanwhile, tried to keep her own life as normal as possible. She continued to care for her grandmother, making sure to check in on her every day, even as she spent long hours sifting through old records and documents. She was exhausted, but she couldn't stop now, not when they were finally making progress. One afternoon, as she was about to head to John's office, she received a call from him, his voice urgent, a stark contrast to his usual calm demeanor. "Lila, I need you to come to my office right away," he said. "I think we've got something." Lila's heart leaped into her throat. "I'm on my way," she said, grabbing her bag and rushing out the door. When she arrived, John was pacing in his office, a mix of excitement and anxiety on his face. "What happened?" she asked, her voice breathless from rushing up the stairs. "I got a call from one of my contacts," John said, stopping to face her. "Someone who used to work in security for one of my old rivals. He heard about our inquiries and reached out to me. Apparently he knew Gray, or at least knew of him." Lila's eyes widened. "What did he say?" John took a deep breath, as if steadying himself. "He said that Gray was a code name used by a man who operated as a sort of fixer, someone who would handle problems for powerful people, usually behind the scenes. But here's the thing, Gray wasn't just any fixer. He was known for making problems disappear permanently. If someone needed to be silenced, or if a situation needed to be resolved quietly, Gray was the man they called." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. "You mean like arranging accidents?" John nodded grimly. "Exactly. And it gets worse. My contact said that Gray's clients weren't just business people. He had connections to law enforcement, politics, even the media. That's why he was so hard to track down. He had people in high places protecting him." Lila's mind raced as she processed what John was saying. "Do you think he was the one behind my mother's accident?" "It's starting to look that way," John said, his voice tight. "But there's something else my contact mentioned, that Gray was known to operate out of a private club downtown. It's a place where the city's elite go to conduct business away from prying eyes. If we want to find out more, that's where we need to start." Lila's heart ached with a mix of fear and determination. "Then that's where we'll go," she said. "We have to find him, John." John looked at her, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "It's dangerous, Lila. If we're right, and this man was involved in what happened to Evelyn, then he won't think twice about hurting anyone who gets too close to the truth. We're walking into the lion's den." "I know," Lila said, her voice steady. "But I'm not backing down. Not now." John nodded, though he still looked uneasy. "All right, but we need to be smart about this. We can't just walk in and start asking questions. We need a plan." Later that evening, John and Lila sat in his office discussing their next move. John explained that the club was members only, and they couldn't just waltz in without an invitation. Fortunately, one of John's acquaintances, A man named Victor was a member. John called him and arranged to meet, hoping to secure their entry without raising suspicion. The next day, they met Victor at a quiet bar across town. He was a tall, imposing man with a neatly trimmed beard and a sharp suit. He greeted John warmly, but his eyes flickered with curiosity when he saw Lila. "So this is the young lady you mentioned," he said, extending his hand to her. "I'm Victor." "Nice to meet you," Lila said, shaking his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to help us." Victor smiled, though there was a hint of caution in his eyes. "I'm not sure I'd call it helping just yet," he said. "John told me you're looking for information on someone who goes by the name Gray. I have to warn you that's a dangerous game you're playing. People who ask too many questions about Gray don't usually stick around for long." "We understand the risks," John said, his tone firm. "But we need to know if you can get us into the club. We might be able to find someone who can point us in the right direction." Victor sighed, as if weighing the decision. "I can get you in," he said finally. "But you need to be careful. Don't draw attention to yourselves. And whatever you do, don't mention Gray's name directly. If he's still around, there's a good chance he has eyes and ears in that place." John nodded. "Understood. We'll be discreet." "Good," Victor said, finishing his drink. "I'll make the arrangements. You'll be my guests, but after that, you're on your own. I can't promise to keep you safe if things go south." The club was as opulent as Lila had imagined, with dark wood paneling, leather armchairs, and a bar that gleamed under the dim, warm lights. It was the kind of place where the city's most powerful people came to relax and negotiate deals that would never be discussed in boardrooms. Victor led them inside, giving a nod to the bouncer at the door. "Try to blend in," he murmured to Lila and John as they walked through the main hall. "You're just here for drinks, nothing more." They settled into a corner booth, their eyes scanning the room. Lila felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Every face around her looked composed, almost bored, but she knew that behind those calm expressions were people who could destroy lives with a single word. She couldn't help but wonder how many of them had known her mother, how many had played a part in the events that had led to her death. As they sipped their drinks, a man approached their table. He was tall and thin, with sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "John Whitman," he said, a smile curling on his lips. "It's been a while." John looked up, his expression guarded. "Oliver." "Yes, it has." Oliver glanced at Lila, his smile widening. "And who is this lovely young lady?" "This is my daughter Lila," John said, his tone even. "She's here with me tonight." Oliver's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he quickly masked it with a chuckle. "I didn't know you had a daughter, John. But then, there are a lot of things I don't know about you, aren't there?" Lila's heart skipped a beat. There was something unsettling about the way Oliver looked at her, as if he was trying to read her thoughts. "Nice to meet you," she said, forcing a polite smile. "The pleasure is mine," Oliver said, though his eyes never left hers. "You know, John, it's been a while since I've seen you around these parts. What brings you back?" "Just catching up with old friends," John said smoothly. "It's always nice to reconnect." Oliver's smile remained, but there was a glint of suspicion in his eyes. "Well, I hope you enjoy your evening," he said finally, turning to leave. "And if you're looking for anything specific, just let me know. I can always point you in the right direction." As soon as he was out of earshot, Lila leaned closer to John. "Who was that?" she whispered. "Oliver is someone who knows things," John said, his voice low. "If anyone here has information on Gray, it's him. But we need to be careful. He's also the type to sell you out if it benefits him." Lila's mind was spinning. "Do you think he suspects something?" "I don't know," John said, his eyes scanning the room. "But we need to find out what he knows, and if he really can point us in the right direction, we have to take that chance." As they sat there trying to decide their next move, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced around, but the faces in the club were unreadable, their conversations low and controlled. For the first time, she truly understood the depth of what they were up against. Gray wasn't just a person. He was a shadow that lingered over everything, and if they weren't careful, he could swallow them whole. But Lila wasn't going to let fear stop her. She had come too far, and she wasn't about to back down now. Whatever secrets this place held, she was going to find them, and she was going to make sure the truth about her mother finally came to light. John and Lila left the club that night feeling more uncertain than ever. Their brief interaction with Oliver had left them with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. If they wanted to learn more about Gray, they would have to play his game, and that meant taking risks. The following day, John decided to reach out to Oliver directly. They needed information, and he suspected that Oliver, with his network of connections, could provide it, for a price. Their brief interaction with Oliver had left them with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. If they wanted to learn more about Gray, they would have to play his game, and that meant taking risks. The following day, John decided to reach out to Oliver directly. They needed information, and he suspected that Oliver, with his network of connections, "I'll handle this," John told Lila as they sat in his office. Oliver is the kind of person who respects directness, but he also likes to have the upper hand. If we're going to get anything out of him, we need to approach carefully. Lila's instincts told her that this was a bad idea, but she trusted John's judgment. "Just be careful," she said. "I don't trust him." "I don't either," John admitted. "But we're running out of options. If we don't get a lead soon, this could go cold, and we might never find out who Gray is." Later that afternoon, John arranged to meet Oliver at a small, discreet restaurant on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where people went when they didn't want to be seen, and Oliver had suggested it himself, which made John uneasy, but he had no other choice. When Oliver arrived, he was dressed impeccably as always, with a casual yet calculated air. "John," he said, sliding into the booth across from him, "I have to say I'm intrigued. What exactly are you looking for?" John leaned back, keeping his expression neutral. "Information," he said simply. "I need to know about Gray, who he is, where he operates, and how I can find him." Oliver chuckled, as if John had just told him a joke. "Ah, straight to the point. I admire that, but you have to understand, information like that doesn't come cheap." "I'm willing to pay," John said, his eyes steady. "Name your price." Oliver's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, it's not about money, John. It's about leverage. You see, people like Gray, they operate in shadows, and those shadows are protected by very powerful people. If I give you what you're asking for, I'm risking a lot. So tell me, why should I do that for you?" John hesitated for a moment, considering his next words carefully. "Because this isn't just about business," he said finally. "It's personal. I want to know why Evelyn was taken from me, and I want to know who was responsible. If Gray was involved, then I'm going to make sure he answers for it." Oliver's eyes darkened slightly. "Evelyn," he said, as if tasting the name. "Yes, I remember her. Lovely woman. It's a shame what happened to her." John's jaw tightened. It wasn't an accident, was it? Oliver didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving John's. "You know, John, you're digging up things that were meant to stay buried. Gray has been around for a long time, and he's very good at what he does. If you're looking for justice, you're going to be disappointed." "I'm not looking for justice," John said, his voice cold. "I'm looking for the truth." Oliver sighed, setting his glass down. "Very well. I can point you in the right direction, but you need to understand that this will come at a cost. Gray doesn't like to be found, and if he senses you're getting close, he will make sure you regret it." "I'll take my chances," John said firmly. "Tell me what you know." Oliver hesitated for a moment, then leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's a warehouse in the industrial district. It's where people conduct business that can't be traced. If you're looking for answers, that's where you'll find them. But be warned, if you go there, you're not going to find a welcoming committee, and if Gray gets wind of this, he will come after you." John nodded, though his heart was pounding. "Thank you," he said. "I'll handle the rest." Oliver's smile returned, but there was something almost pitying about it. "Good luck, John. You're going to need it." When John relayed the information to Lila, she was immediately concerned. "A warehouse? This sounds like a trap," she said. "What if Gray knows we're coming?" "He might," John admitted, "but we don't have much of a choice. If Oliver is telling the truth, this could be our best chance to find out more about who Gray really is." Lila's mind was racing. She wanted answers as much as John did, but the thought of walking into an unknown situation without a clear plan terrified her. "We need backup," she said. "We can't just go there without knowing what we're walking into." "I agree," John said. "I've already reached out to one of my security contacts. He's discreet, and he can give us some support from a distance. We'll have eyes on the place before we get anywhere near it." Lila was relieved, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much bigger than they realized. "When do we go?" "Tomorrow night," John said. "That's when the activity at the warehouse is usually busiest. We'll blend in with the traffic and get close enough to see what's going on." The next evening, Lila and John found themselves in a dark, deserted alley across from the warehouse. They had arrived separately to avoid drawing attention, but now they were together, waiting for the signal from John's contact. The air was cold, and Lila's hands shook slightly as she clutched her phone, trying to stay calm. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, glancing at John. "We could still turn back." "No," John said, his voice resolute. "We need to see this through. If Gray was involved in Evelyn's death, then this might be our only chance to prove it." Lila nodded, swallowing her fear. "Okay, let's do it." A few minutes later, John's phone buzzed. It was a message from his contact. "Clear for now. 2 guards at the entrance, but no sign of Gray." "Looks like we're good to go," John said, showing the message to Lila. "Let's move." They approached the warehouse cautiously, sticking to the shadows. As they got closer, they could hear voices coming from inside, muffled by the thick walls. The building was large and imposing, with a few scattered lights casting eerie shadows across the ground. John led the way to a side entrance where they could slip in without being seen. The door was unlocked, and they quietly pushed it open, slipping inside. The interior of the warehouse was dark, with narrow beams of light cutting through the gloom. Stacks of crates lined the walls, and the air smelled of oil and dust. They moved silently, listening for any signs of movement. As they made their way deeper into the building, they could hear faint murmurs of conversation coming from a room at the far end. John motioned for Lila to follow, and they crept closer, straining to hear what was being said. "A shipment will be ready by next week," a voice said, barely audible. "Make sure it gets to the dock without any issues." "Understood," another voice replied. "And what about the Whitman situation? Should we be concerned?" Lila's heart stopped. They were talking about John. "Not yet," the first voice said. "Gray hasn't given any orders, but if they keep poking around, we'll have to take care of it." John's eyes met Lila's, and she could see the alarm in them. They were being watched, and whoever was behind this was already planning their next move. "We need to get out of here," John whispered, his voice barely audible. But just as they turned to leave, they heard the sound of a door opening behind them. They froze, their hearts pounding as footsteps echoed through the warehouse. A tall, shadowy figure stepped into view, and Lila felt a wave of fear wash over her as she realized who it was. It was Oliver. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I have to say, I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd actually have the guts to show up here." John's hands clenched into fists. "You set us up." Oliver shrugged, his smile widening. "Of course I did. You're not the only one who knows how to play the game, John. But don't worry, you're not leaving empty-handed. I have a message for you from Gray." Before John or Lila could react, 2 men stepped out of the shadows behind Oliver, blocking their escape. "You've been asking too many questions, John," Oliver said, his tone suddenly cold. "And Gray doesn't like that. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop digging. You're going to walk away. Because if you don't, well, let's just say your little reunion with your daughter won't last much longer." Lila's blood ran cold. She could see the seriousness in Oliver's eyes, and she knew he wasn't bluffing. "We're not afraid of you," she said, though her voice shook. Oliver laughed. "Maybe not now, but you will be." As he turned to leave, he glanced back at John one last time. "Consider this your last warning, John. If you want to stay alive, you'll keep your nose out of Gray's business, because the next time we meet, I won't be so generous." John and Lila stood frozen, their minds racing. They had come looking for answers, but all they had found was a new layer of threats. And now they knew one thing for certain: Gray was watching them, and he was ready to do whatever it took to keep his secrets hidden. John and Lila left the warehouse that night with their hearts pounding and minds racing. The encounter with Oliver had confirmed their worst fears. They were being watched, and whoever Gray was, he had eyes everywhere. As they drove back to John's office in silence, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They had pushed too far, and now they were in serious danger. When they arrived, John parked the car and turned to Lila, his expression grim. "We need to stop, at least for now," he said, his voice low but firm. "Gray has people everywhere, and if we keep pushing, we're going to get hurt or worse." Lila stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be serious," she said. "We're closer than ever. We can't just walk away now." "I know how you feel, Lila," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I'm not willing to risk your life." Oliver was right about one thing. Gray doesn't leave loose ends. If we keep digging, he'll come after us, and he won't miss next time. Lila's hands were trembling, but she clenched them into fists, trying to steady herself. "I'm not afraid of him," she said, her voice resolute. "He took everything from us, from you, from me, from my mother. I'm not going to let him get away with it." John felt a mix of pride and fear as he looked at her. She had her mother's spirit, her unyielding strength, and he admired her for it, but he also knew that strength could be dangerous. "Lila," he said softly, "I've already lost one person I loved because of this. I can't lose you too." For a moment, Lila's resolve faltered, but then she took a deep breath and shook her head. "I understand why you're scared," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "But I'm not going to stop. You said you wanted the truth, and so do I. If Gray thinks he can scare us into giving up, he's wrong." John sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had spent years trying to find closure, to make peace with the loss of Evelyn. But now, standing on the edge of a dangerous conspiracy, he realized that peace would never come unless they saw this through. "All right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "but we need to be smart about this. If we're going to keep digging, we can't let Gray know we're still looking. We'll need to move quietly, carefully." Lila nodded, relief washing over her. "We can do that," she said, "but we need a new plan, something that will let us get close to him without drawing attention." The following day, they began to work on a new approach. John had a few trusted contacts who specialized in surveillance and discreet investigations, and he reached out to them, asking for help in tracking down any information on Gray. Meanwhile, Lila focused on a different angle. She started looking into old newspaper archives, searching for any mention of accidents or incidents that matched the pattern of what had happened to her mother. It was tedious, frustrating work, but it paid off. After several days of searching, Lila found an article about a car crash that had happened 2 years before Evelyn's death. The circumstances were eerily similar. A single car accident on a quiet road late at night, with no witnesses. The victim was a businesswoman who had been involved in a legal dispute with a major corporation at the time of her death. Lila's pulse quickened as she read through the details. There was no direct link to Gray, but the pattern was there. "John," she said, rushing into his office with the article. "Look at this. Doesn't it sound familiar?" John scanned the page, his expression darkening. "It does," he said. "Too familiar. If this is connected to Gray, then it means he's been active for a long time. And if he's willing to eliminate people over business disputes, then there's no telling how far his influence goes." "Which means we need to find someone who knows him," Lila said. "Someone who's worked with him or seen how he operates. There has to be a way to get closer." John thought for a moment. Then his eyes lit up with an idea. Oliver mentioned that Gray had connections to law enforcement, politics, and the media. If we can find someone in those circles who's willing to talk, we might be able to get a lead on him. Lila's heart skipped a beat. Do you have anyone in mind? There's one person, John said, his voice cautious. A journalist named Alex Mitchell. He's known for investigating corruption and has been digging into the city's underworld for years. If anyone has heard whispers about Gray, it would be him. Do you trust him? Lila asked. I don't know, John admitted. But he has a reputation for being persistent, and he's not afraid of making enemies. If he's willing to talk, he could be our best chance. That evening, John made the call. Alex agreed to meet them at a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place he frequented to avoid being seen by the people he was investigating. When John and Lila arrived, they found him sitting at a booth in the back, nursing a cup of coffee. He was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a tired expression, as if he had seen more than his share of the city's dark side. John Whitman, Alex said as they approached. I have to say, I didn't expect to get a call from you. What's this about? John sat down, with Lila taking a seat beside him. We need information, he said bluntly, about a man who goes by the name Gray. Alex's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't seem surprised. Gray, huh? That's a dangerous name to be throwing around. What makes you think I know anything about him? We're not asking for much, Lila said, leaning forward. Just whatever you can tell us. We're trying to find out who he is and why he's been targeting people. Alex studied them for a moment, his expression unreadable. People who go looking for Gray don't usually come out of it unscathed, he said. If you're serious about this, you need to understand what you're getting into. We understand, John said, but we need answers. Alex sighed, as if resigning himself to a decision he didn't want to make. All right, he said. I've heard of Gray. He's not a name you hear often, but when you do, it's usually in hushed tones. He's not just some enforcer. He's an operator, someone who makes problems disappear, and he does it in a way that leaves no trace. That's why he's so hard to track. Lila's heart raced. Do you know how we can find him? I don't, Alex said, shaking his head. But I've heard rumors about where he operates. There's a private estate on the edge of the city, a place where people go to conduct business away from prying eyes. It's owned by a shell company, but word is, Gray uses it as a base of operations. If you're looking for him, that might be your best shot. John's eyes narrowed. Why are you telling us this? Because I've been trying to get close to Gray for years, and I've never been able to, Alex said, his tone bitter. He's untouchable, but if you're crazy enough to try, I figure I might as well point you in the right direction. Just don't expect it to be easy. Gray doesn't take kindly to people poking around his business. Lila felt a surge of hope. Thank you, Alex, she said. We'll be careful. You'd better be, Alex said, his eyes serious. Because if Gray finds out you're looking for him, he won't just come after you. He'll make sure you disappear, just like all the others. The private estate was a sprawling mansion surrounded by high walls and security cameras, nestled in a secluded area on the edge of the city. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, and no one saw anything they weren't supposed to. For John and Lila, it was their next destination, and the thought of going there filled them with equal parts dread and determination. They spent the next few days preparing, gathering as much information as they could about the estate and its layout. John arranged for a car and disguises that would help them blend in, while Lila studied maps and planned their approach. They knew this was risky, possibly the most dangerous thing they had ever done, but they were out of options. If they wanted answers, this was their chance to get them. On the night of the operation, they parked the car a short distance from the estate and made their way to a service entrance. The night was cool, and the sky was clouded over, casting everything in a dark, ominous shade. As they approached the gate, Lila's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear herself think. This is it, John whispered. Are you ready? Lila nodded, though she could barely breathe. Yes, let's do this. They slipped through the gate and into the shadows, moving silently along the side of the building. The estate was eerily quiet, with only the occasional distant sound of a car passing by on the nearby road. They crept closer, scanning the windows for any sign of movement, until they reached a side door that led into the mansion. As they stepped inside, they found themselves in a dimly lit hallway, with the faint sound of voices coming from somewhere deeper within the building. Lila's nerves were on edge, but she forced herself to stay focused. They had to find something, anything that could lead them to Gray. They made their way down the hallway, careful to avoid making any noise, until they reached a door that was slightly ajar. John peered through the crack, and his eyes widened as he saw what was inside. In the room there were several men sitting around a table, deep in conversation, but it wasn't the men who caught John's attention. It was the stack of files on the table, each marked with a different name. One of them had Evelyn's name on it. Lila's heart skipped a beat as she saw the file. "That's it," she whispered. "We need to get that." John nodded, but just as he was about to move, the door creaked open and the men inside turned, their eyes locking onto him and Lila. There was a moment of stunned silence, and then one of the men stood up, his expression dark and threatening. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Looks like we have some uninvited guests. I wonder how Gray will feel about this." Lila felt a surge of panic, but she refused to back down. "We're not leaving without those files," she said, her voice shaking but determined. The man's smile widened, and he took a step forward. "I don't think you understand the situation, sweetheart," he said. "You're not leaving at all." As the men closed in, John and Lila knew they were trapped. They had come searching for answers, but now they were about to face the consequences of getting too close to the truth, and somewhere deep within the shadows of the estate, Gray was waiting, watching, ready to make his move. John and Lila's hearts pounded in their chests as the men closed in on them. The room felt smaller, the air thicker with tension. Lila's mind raced, searching for a way out, but she knew they were cornered. The men in front of them, their smug expressions and predatory eyes, made it clear they weren't going to let them leave easily, if at all. John stepped in front of Lila protectively, his fists clenched. "You don't want to do this," he warned, his voice calm but filled with barely controlled anger. "We're only here for the truth." The lead man, tall with a scar running down the side of his face, chuckled darkly. "The truth? You're in the wrong place for that, old man. No one here is interested in the truth. Gray doesn't leave loose ends, and you're looking like a pretty big one right now." John knew there was no reasoning with them. They were Gray's people, loyal and ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to take them out. But John wasn't about to give up. "Let us walk out of here," he said firmly, "and we won't come back." The scarred man's smile faded, replaced by cold, calculating eyes. "No," he said simply, and with a nod the men began to advance. Lila's breath caught in her throat. They were out of time. She grabbed John's arm, pulling him back. "We have to run," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. John didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing her hand, he bolted for the door behind them, dragging Lila along as the men shouted and lunged toward them. They sprinted down the narrow hallway, the sound of footsteps pounding behind them. Lila's heart raced, her legs burning as she struggled to keep up with John's long strides. The mansion was a maze of corridors and rooms, and as they turned corner after corner, Lila realized they had no idea where they were going. "Where's the exit?" she gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "I don't know," John said through gritted teeth. "We just have to keep moving." The voices behind them grew louder, closer, and Lila's stomach twisted with fear. They were being hunted. Every step echoed in the silence of the mansion, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. John glanced over his shoulder and saw the men closing the distance. "This way," he urged, spotting a staircase leading down to what looked like a cellar door. They stumbled down the stairs, the narrow space making it difficult to move quickly. John yanked the cellar door open, and they ducked inside, slamming it shut behind them. The darkness enveloped them, and for a moment, all they could hear was their own labored breathing. Lila's heart pounded in her chest, but the momentary reprieve gave her a chance to catch her breath. "What now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the darkness. John scanned the room, searching for anything that could help. The cellar was cramped with low ceilings and dusty shelves filled with old boxes and equipment. There was only one small window near the ceiling, too high and narrow for either of them to escape through. "We'll have to find another way out," he said quietly. Suddenly the door rattled behind them. The men had found them. "Get ready," John muttered, bracing himself against the door. "They'll be through any second." Lila's heart leaped into her throat. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor, her hands trembling. She wasn't a fighter, but she wasn't about to let them be captured without a struggle. The door burst open and the first man lunged in, his eyes wild with anger. John swung a metal pipe he'd found, catching the man squarely in the chest and sending him sprawling back into the hallway. But before they could react, another man pushed through, grabbing John by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "John!" Lila screamed, rushing toward them without thinking. She swung the wooden plank at the man, hitting him in the side. He grunted in pain, but his grip on John didn't loosen. Instead, he shoved John harder into the wall, pinning him there. "Lila, run!" John shouted, his voice filled with desperation. But Lila wasn't about to leave him. She raised the plank again, preparing to strike, but the man grabbed her arm before she could swing. His grip was like iron, and she cried out in pain as he twisted her wrist, forcing her to drop the plank. "Enough of this," the man growled, shoving both John and Lila to the floor. He pulled a gun from his waistband, leveling it at John's chest. "Gray warned you, Whitman. You should have listened." Lila's blood ran cold as she stared at the gun, her heart hammering in her chest. "No!" she cried, struggling to get to her feet, but the man's companion grabbed her, holding her back. Time seemed to slow as the man raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Lila's mind raced, and her body screamed with helplessness. This couldn't be how it ended. They were so close. They had come so far. Suddenly, there was a deafening bang, and Lila flinched, expecting the worst. But when she opened her eyes, the man with the gun was staggering backward, a look of shock on his face. Blood bloomed on his chest, and he collapsed to the floor. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she saw who had fired the shot. Oliver stood in the doorway, a gun still smoking in his hand. For a moment, the room was silent. And then Oliver lowered the gun, his expression unreadable. "I told you to stay out of this, John," he said, his voice cold. "But I guess I owe you one." The second man, still holding Lila, froze, his eyes darting between Oliver and the gun in his hand. Without a word, he released her and bolted out of the room, disappearing down the hallway. Lila stumbled forward, her body trembling with shock. John scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily. "Oliver, why?" Oliver shrugged, slipping the gun into his jacket. "I'm not a fan of loose ends, but I'm even less of a fan of messy situations. You two were about to make this very messy." Lila's mind was spinning. "You saved us." "Don't get the wrong idea," Oliver said, his tone sharp. "I didn't do this out of the goodness of my heart. You two are a liability, and Gray doesn't know I'm here. But you need to get out of here before anyone else finds you." John took a step toward him, still cautious. "Why are you helping us?" Oliver's eyes narrowed. "Because I'm tired of playing this game, John. Gray's people have got too powerful, and I'm not sticking my neck out for them anymore. But that doesn't mean I'm on your side. Consider this a one-time favor." Lila could barely believe what she was hearing. After everything Oliver had done, after all the lies and manipulation, he was saving them now. "What about the files?" she asked, glancing at the folder with her mother's name on it. Oliver hesitated, then nodded toward the table. "Take them," he said, "but be smart about how you use them. Gray won't stop until you're dead if he finds out you have those." John moved quickly, grabbing the files and tucking them under his arm. "Thank you," he said, though the words felt strange on his tongue. "Don't thank me," Oliver said darkly. "Just disappear." Lila and John exchanged a glance, and then they bolted for the exit. Oliver didn't follow them, and neither of them looked back. The only sound was their frantic footsteps as they ran through the estate, through the shadows, and out into the night. They didn't stop running until they reached the car, both of them gasping for air. John fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and they sped off into the darkness, not daring to slow down until the mansion was miles behind them. For a long time, neither of them spoke, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy between them. Lila stared out the window, her mind racing. They had the files, but now they knew just how far Gray's reach extended. They had narrowly escaped with their lives, and she wasn't sure they would be so lucky next time. John finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "I can't believe it." "Neither can I," Lila said, her heart still pounding. "Oliver, why would he do that?" "I don't know," John admitted. "But whatever his reason, we owe him." Lila shook her head. "We can't trust him. He's just as dangerous as the rest of them." "Maybe," John said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But for now, we've got what we came for." Lila glanced at the files in John's lap. They were the key to everything, the answers they had been searching for, but they were also the most dangerous thing they had ever held. "What now?" she asked quietly. John's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Now we find out the truth, no matter what it costs." The drive back to John's office was silent, the air heavy with tension. Lila's mind was a storm of thoughts, each one crashing into the next. They had barely escaped the mansion, and now they had the files, but with them came a new set of dangers. Every name, every piece of information inside those folders could be the key to unraveling Gray's network, but it also meant they were targets. When they arrived, John quickly locked the office door behind them. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice urgent. "If Gray finds out what we've taken, he'll come for us. We need to find out what's in these files and figure out our next move." Lila nodded, though her hands were still trembling from the adrenaline. "Let's see what we have." They sat down at John's desk, and he carefully laid out the files. There were several folders, each one marked with a different name, but the one that caught their attention was the file with Evelyn's name, her mother's name, scrolled across the top. John opened it, and as they began to sift through the pages, Lila's stomach twisted. The file was a detailed account of Evelyn's last days, filled with surveillance photos, phone records, and notes. Every move she had made, every person she had met, had been meticulously documented. It was as if someone had been following her, tracking her every step. "This is insane," Lila whispered, her voice shaking. "Why would anyone go to this length?" John's expression darkened. "Because she was a threat," he said quietly. "Whoever was behind this wanted to make sure she was controlled, and when that didn't work, they eliminated her." Lila's heart ached as she read through the pages, each word a painful reminder of how her mother's life had been manipulated, controlled, and ultimately taken away. There were notes about her mother's plans to meet with someone, details of a business transaction she had been involved in, and even references to John. It was clear now that whoever had orchestrated this had been trying to keep Evelyn from reconnecting with John, from revealing the truth. John's hand shook as he flipped to the final pages. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a name that appeared repeatedly in the notes. "Malcolm Warren." Lila's eyes widened. "He was involved, but he said he only delivered the letter." "It looks like he did a lot more than that," John said, his voice cold. "He was reporting on Evelyn's movements, feeding information to someone higher up. And it wasn't just him. There are references to payments, transactions. This was a coordinated effort." Lila's pulse quickened. "Then that means he knew all along," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "He lied to us. He was working for Gray." John nodded, his jaw clenched. "It's worse than that," he said, pulling out another sheet. "Look here." Lila leaned in, reading the paper. It was a transaction record showing a large sum of money transferred to an account under a name she didn't recognize. But beside it, there was a note scrolled hastily in the margin. "Payment for Evelyn's elimination confirmed." Her blood ran cold. "They paid to have her killed," she said, barely able to get the words out. "It wasn't just an accident, it was murder." John's eyes were dark with rage, and Lila could see the pain etched into his features. "I always suspected it," he said quietly, But seeing it here, knowing it was planned, it makes it real. Lila's hands tightened into fists. We need to find out who was behind this. If Malcolm was involved, then maybe he can lead us to Gray. We have to confront him. Make him tell us the truth. I don't think he'll talk willingly, John said. Not if he's as deep in this as these files suggest. But we can't let this go. We have to confront him, and if he refuses to cooperate, we'll have to find another way to make him talk. The next morning, John and Lila set out to find Malcolm. They knew it would be risky, but they didn't have a choice. Armed with the knowledge from the files, they tracked him down to his office, a small, nondescript building in a quiet part of town. When they arrived, the receptionist informed them that Malcolm was in a meeting, but John insisted they couldn't wait. After a brief argument, they were allowed through. Malcolm looked up, startled as they entered his office. "John, Lila, what are you doing here?" he said, trying to hide the surprise in his voice. "We need to talk," John said, his tone cold, "and this time we're not leaving until we get answers." Malcolm's eyes flickered with unease. "I already told you everything I know," he said, but his voice was shaky, uncertain. "I don't have anything more to give you." Lila stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "Don't lie to us," she said. "We know you were involved. We found the files, the records, everything. You were feeding information to Gray, and you helped arrange my mother's death." Malcolm's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "Enough!" John snapped, slamming the file onto Malcolm's desk. "We have proof. You can try to deny it all you want, but we know the truth. The only question now is whether you're going to cooperate, or if we'll have to find other ways to make you talk." Malcolm stared at the file, his hands trembling. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was just following orders. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." "Then tell us who gave the orders," John said, leaning in closer. "Who is Gray? Who paid you to do this?" For a moment it seemed like Malcolm was going to refuse, but then he broke. All right, he said, his voice cracking. "I'll tell you, but you have to promise me protection. If Gray finds out I talked, I'm as good as dead." "We can't promise you anything," Lila said, her voice cold. "But if you tell us what we need to know, we might be able to keep you out of this mess." Malcolm swallowed hard, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "Gray isn't just one person," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's an organization, a network of people who handle things quietly, efficiently. They take care of problems, and they make sure no one asks questions." "Who's at the top?" John pressed. "Who runs it?" "I don't know his real name," Malcolm said, shaking his head. "I only ever dealt with intermediaries, but there's a man. He goes by the director. He's the one who gives the orders, the one who decides who lives and who dies. And he's very careful. No one meets him unless he wants them to." Lila's heart pounded. "How do we find him?" "You don't," Malcolm said, his voice filled with despair. "You can't. That's the whole point. He's untouchable. The only way you'll ever get close is if he wants you to. But if you keep digging, he'll come after you. And when he does, you won't see it coming." John's eyes darkened. "We're not backing down. We're going to find him, and we're going to make him pay for what he did." Malcolm looked at them, a mix of fear and pity in his eyes. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said, "because once you start down this path, there's no turning back." As they left Malcolm's office, Lila felt a sense of grim determination settle over her. They finally had a name, the director, and a better understanding of the organization they were up against. But it also meant they were in deeper than ever, and the risks were higher than they had imagined. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John's jaw was set, his eyes filled with resolve. "We find the director," he said. "If he's the one behind this, then he's the one who needs to answer for it, and we're going to make sure he does." Lila nodded, though she could feel the fear gnawing at her. They were closer than ever to uncovering the truth, but they were also closer to danger than they had ever been. "We'll need help," she said. "We can't do this alone." "I know," John said. "We'll find allies, people who want to see Gray brought down as much as we do. But whatever happens, we're not stopping until we see this through." As they drove away from Malcolm's office, the city lights flickering in the distance, Lila felt a strange mix of hope and dread. They had finally pierced the veil of Gray's network, but they had also uncovered a much darker, more dangerous enemy. And somewhere in the shadows, the director was watching, waiting, ready to strike back. But she wasn't going to let fear stop her. She had come too far, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to bring the truth to light, for her mother, for John, and for herself. The days that followed were a blur of planning and preparation. John and Lila knew they were running out of time. Every moment they spent trying to find the director, Gray's enigmatic leader, was a moment closer to being discovered, and they had to move quickly if they were going to have any chance of exposing the truth. John reached out to his old contacts, calling in favors and gathering information wherever he could. Lila, meanwhile, continued to dig through the files they had taken from the estate, looking for anything that might lead them to the director. But as they sifted through the endless pages of documents, she began to realize just how vast and complex Gray's network was. It wasn't just a small group of criminals. It was an empire, one that had its hands in everything from business to politics to law enforcement. One night, as they were poring over the files in John's office, Lila found a document that made her heart stop. It was a list of names, each one marked with a date and a code. She recognized some of the names: journalists, business people, even a politician. But what caught her attention was the last name on the list, Evelyn Porter. Next to her name was a code that she hadn't seen before, but she could guess what it meant. John saw the look on her face and moved closer, reading over her shoulder. "What is it?" he asked. "It's a list," Lila said, her voice shaking. "I think it's a list of people they eliminated." She could barely say the word, but she forced herself to keep going. "And my mother is on it." John's face darkened as he read the document. "They've been keeping records of every person they've targeted," he said, his voice low. "This is how they operate. They catalog everything, keep track of who they've silenced. It's sick." Lila's hands were trembling as she turned the page. "There's more," she said. "Look at this." The next page was a series of emails, encrypted and full of coded language, but one name stood out among the messages: the director. It was clear that whoever was sending these emails was giving orders and coordinating the activities of Gray's network. "We have to decode this," Lila said, her eyes wide. "This could be the key to everything." John nodded, his mind racing. "If we can figure out where these emails are coming from, we might be able to trace them back to the director. But we're going to need help to do it." The next day, John and Lila met with Alex, the journalist who had provided them with information about Gray's estate. Alex had agreed to help them, though he made it clear that he was taking a huge risk by getting involved. "If Gray finds out I'm helping you, I'm done for," he said, as they sat in a secluded cafe away from prying eyes. "But if we can bring this to light, it'll be worth it." "We need to decode these emails," John said, showing Alex the documents. "Can you do it?" Alex took the papers, glancing over them. "I know a guy who can," he said. "He's a tech expert and he's good at cracking this kind of encryption, but he's going to need some time." "Time is something we don't have much of," Lila said, her voice tense. "Can he do it quickly?" "I'll make sure of it," Alex said. "But you need to be ready. If these emails lead to the director, it's going to bring a lot of heat down on you. You're not just poking the bear anymore. You're going to war." John's eyes were resolute. "We understand the risks. Just get it done." A few days later, Alex called with the news they had been waiting for. "We've cracked the encryption," he said, his voice urgent. "And you're not going to believe this. The emails, they're coming from a private server located at a mansion in the outskirts of the city. But here's the kicker. The property is listed under a corporation that belongs to your brother John." John felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. "What?" he said, barely able to process the words. "That's impossible. My brother would never. He doesn't have anything to do with this." "Are you sure about that?" Alex asked, his voice careful. Because all the evidence points to him. The director isn't just some shadowy figure in the background. He's been right under your nose the entire time. Lila's mind reeled. John, what if your brother is the director? No, John said, shaking his head. There's no way. I've known him my whole life. He would never be involved in something like this. But as the words left his mouth, doubt began to creep in. He thought about all the times his brother had been secretive, all the unexplained absences, the sudden rise to power. Could it really be true? We need to confront him, Lila said, her voice firm. If he's the director, he has to answer for what he's done. We can't let him hide behind Gray's network anymore. John's heart ached at the thought. If his brother was involved, it would mean that the person he had trusted most in the world had betrayed him. All right, he said finally, his voice barely steady. But we need to be careful. If he's really behind this, he won't let us expose him without a fight. They drove to the mansion that night, their minds heavy with the weight of what they were about to do. The sprawling estate loomed in the darkness, surrounded by tall gates and guarded by security cameras. It was a place John had visited many times over the years, but tonight it felt foreign, like the lair of a stranger. As they approached the gate, Lila felt a surge of anxiety. What's the plan? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We go in, we confront him, and we make him talk, John said, though he could hardly believe the words himself. If he's the director, then he has to explain why he did this. And if he's not, we'll find out who is. They entered the mansion, the tension thick in the air. John's brother William was in the study, sitting behind a large mahogany desk. He looked up as they entered, a look of surprise crossing his face. John, Lila, what are you doing here? John felt his chest tighten. We need to talk, William, he said, his voice cold. About Gray. For a moment, William's expression was unreadable, but then he smiled a slow, knowing smile. So you figured it out then, he said, leaning back in his chair. I was wondering how long it would take you. Lila's heart dropped. You're the director, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You've been running this all along. Yes, William said calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. I've been managing Gray's network for years. It's quite efficient, really. We handle problems, we protect our interests, and we make sure everything runs smoothly. But I never thought my own brother would be the one to try and bring me down. John's mind reeled. Why, William? He said, his voice choked with emotion. Why would you do this? Because it's necessary, William said, his eyes cold. You don't understand, John. This is how the world works. People like us, we don't get to where we are by playing by the rules. We make our own rules, and sometimes that means making hard decisions. You had Evelyn killed, Lila said, her voice shaking with fury. You destroyed our lives. William's expression softened slightly. I didn't want to, he said quietly. But she was a risk, John. She was going to expose things that could have ruined everything. I tried to stop it, to keep her quiet, but she wouldn't listen. So I did what I had to do. John felt like he was going to be sick. She was the woman I loved, he said, his voice barely a whisper. And you had her murdered. It was business, John, William said, his tone cold and unfeeling. Nothing personal. Lila stepped forward, her eyes blazing. This isn't over, she said. We're going to expose you, and you're going to pay for everything you've done. William's smile returned, but it was colder than ever. I wouldn't be so sure about that, he said. You're not leaving this mansion tonight. I have people on the way, and they're going to make sure you never get the chance to tell anyone what you found out. John's heart pounded, and he knew they were out of time. Run, Lila, he said, grabbing her arm. We have to get out of here. But before they could move, the door burst open, and two armed men stepped into the room, blocking their escape. William stood up, his smile widening. It's over, John. You should have stayed out of this. Lila's mind raced, but she refused to give up. She grabbed a vase from the desk and threw it at one of the men, creating a momentary distraction. Go, she shouted, pulling John toward the window. They smashed through the glass, crashing onto the grass outside as the guards shouted and scrambled after them. John and Lila sprinted across the lawn, their hearts pounding, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. They had uncovered the truth, and now they had to escape with it, no matter the cost. As they ran through the darkness, the mansion fading behind them, they knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And they would stop at nothing to bring the director down.